There is one generation almost nobody talks about. We talk about boomers all the time. We analyze millennials like they are the generation that broke under pressure. We study Gen Z as if there's some new digital experiment happening right in front of us. But between all of them, there's a generation that quietly stands in the middle. Generation X. Born roughly between the mid-1960s and the early 1980s, they're often overlooked, misunderstood, and underestimated. They are the generation that does not usually scream for attention. They do not need to turn every emotion into a public statement. They do not post every meal, every opinion, every victory, or every breakdown online. They're often the people who just keep going. The older coworker who solves the problem without making a scene. The parent who seems emotionally distant, but somehow always finds a way to handle the crisis. The adult who rarely asks for help, but shows up when everyone else disappears. And that is what makes Generation X so psychologically fascinating. They were not raised to be seen. They were raised to survive. Generation X grew up in a strange moment in history. The old world was still there, but it was beginning to crack. Families were changing. Divorce rates were rising. Both parents were often working. Companies that once promised security started laying people off. Institutions no longer felt as trustworthy as they once had. And in the middle of all of that, millions of children were coming home from school to empty houses. No smartphones, no location tracking, no quick message saying, "I'm home," no cameras, no adult checking every move. Just a key, a door, an empty room, and silence. Imagine being 8 or 9 years old, walking home from school, unlocking the front door, making yourself a snack, doing your homework alone, watching television, and waiting for your parents to come back from work. That may sound simple, but psychologically, it changes something. Because when a child repeatedly learns that no one is immediately coming to help, the brain adapts. It learns to stay calm. It learns to solve problems alone. It learns to hide fear. It learns that complaining does not change much. It learns that if something goes wrong, you need to figure it out. This is one wrong you need to figure out. This is one of the deepest roots of Generation X psychology. Self-reliance was not a personality trait. It was survival training. They did not become independent because someone gave them an inspirational speech about confidence. They became independent because the environment demanded it. They had to make decisions without constant supervision. They had to manage boredom without endless entertainment. They had to deal with loneliness without instantly reaching someone. They had to learn how to wait, how to improvise, and how to keep moving. And this shaped the way they still operate today. Generation X tends to be calm in a crisis, not because they do not feel stress, but because they were trained early to function under pressure. When something goes wrong, their first instinct is usually not to panic. It is to ask what needs to be done. This is why many people from Generation X seem strangely practical. They may not talk much about emotions in the moment. They may not immediately explain how they feel. They may not ask for validation. They just act. They fix the problem. Then maybe, much later, they process what happened. But their emotional armor did not come from nowhere. Generation X grew up watching a world that made promises it could not always keep. They were told that if you worked hard, followed the rules, and stayed loyal, things would work out. But then they saw loyal employees get laid off. They saw marriages fall apart. They saw parents struggle financially. They saw politicians fail, institutions break trust, and companies change the rules whenever it benefited them. So they learned something very important. Do not trust the system too much. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. To outsiders, this can look like cynicism. But for Generation X, it often feels like realism. They are not necessarily negative people. They are people who learn that life can pull the rug out from under you without warning. So they became cautious. They became observant. They became emotionally guarded. They learned to scan the room, read the situation, and think 3 steps ahead. And that is one reason why irony became such a powerful part of Generation X culture. For them, humor is not just entertainment. It is protection. A sarcastic comment can hide disappointment. A joke can create distance from pain. A dry reaction can keep vulnerability under control. They learn to laugh before something hurt too much. They learn to stay detached enough so that disappointment would not completely destroy them. This is why Generation X often has a very specific kind of humor. Sharp, dry, skeptical, and emotionally intelligent without being overly sentimental. They can care deeply, but still make a joke about it. They can be worried, but pretend they're just being sarcastic. They can feel a lot, but reveal only a little. And this also connects to their relationship with privacy. For many people today, sharing life online feels normal. But for Generation X, privacy was the default. When they made mistakes growing up, those mistakes usually stayed local. Maybe a few friends knew. Maybe the neighborhood heard about it. Maybe it became an embarrassing story. But it did not live forever online. There was no viral video, no screenshot, no permanent digital record, no strangers analyzing your worst moment. So to many Gen Zers, exposing your entire life online does not feel exciting. It feels dangerous. It is not that they do not understand technology. In fact, Generation X lived through one of the most important technological transitions in human history. They remember the world before the internet, and they adapted to the world after it. They used libraries, card catalogs, encyclopedias, landline phones, cassette tapes, VHS, paper maps, and handwritten notes. Then they watched computers enter homes. They watched the internet become normal. They watched social media transform human behavior. They watched phones turn into extensions of the human mind. So Generation X understands technology in a unique way. They know how powerful it is, but they also remember what life felt like without it. They know what boredom felt like. They know what silence felt like. They know what it meant to sit alone with your own thoughts. They know what it meant to search for an answer instead of instantly receiving one. And that matters, because when information required effort, people related to knowledge differently. If you had to go to a library, search through shelves, open books, compare sources, and spend time finding an answer, that answer carried weight. You remembered it. You respected it. You had to earn it. Generation X grew up with a kind of mental patience that is becoming rare today. They learned how to wait. They learned how to figure things out. They learned how to tolerate not knowing something immediately. And they also learned how to fix things. If the bike chain came loose, you flipped the bike over and tried to fix it. If the television had a problem, someone tapped it, adjusted the antenna, opened the back, or tried something. If a toy broke, you did not always throw it away. You tried to repair it. This built a practical relationship with the physical world. Generation X developed the belief that with enough patience, observation, and effort, many problems could be solved. Not perfectly, not always, but often enough to build confidence. This is why many Gen Zers are highly competent in quiet ways. They may not advertise their skills, but they usually know how to handle more than people expect. And this carries into their work ethic. Generation X often does not believe blindly in company loyalty. They saw too many people give their lives to companies that later discarded them. But they do believe in personal competence. They may not trust the organization completely, but they trust their own ability to become useful, adaptable, and hard to replace. This is why many of them work with a quiet intensity. They do not always need applause. They do not always need recognition. They do not always need someone checking in every 5 minutes. They just want to know what needs to be done. Then they do it. But there's also a cost to this kind of independence. When you spend your whole life learning to handle everything alone, asking for help can feel unnatural. For many people in Generation X, asking for support does not feel like a normal human need. It feels like failure. They may be exhausted and still say, "I'm fine." They may be overwhelmed and still say, "I'll figure out." They may need emotional support, but avoid asking because dependence feels unsafe. This is one of the hidden struggles of Generation X. They are incredibly capable, but sometimes too capable for their own good. They can survive almost anything, but survival is not the same as peace. They can carry responsibility, but carrying everything alone eventually becomes heavy. They can solve problems, but sometimes they struggle to let someone else help. And yet, there is a beautiful paradox inside this generation. They may hate asking for help, but they often show up when others need them. They may not talk much about loyalty, but they practice it. They may not post emotional messages online, but they will quietly help you move, fix your problem, cover your shift, take care of the details, or stand beside you when things get difficult. Their love is often practical, not always loud, not always soft, not always expressed in perfect words, but real. For Generation X, care often looks like action. It looks like solving something, providing something, protecting someone, staying calm when someone else is falling apart. This can sometimes create misunderstandings with younger generations, who may expect more verbal reassurance, more emotional openness, or more visible affection. But many Gen Zers were not raised in a world where every feeling was discussed. They were raised in a world where people showed love by working hard, keeping the lights on, giving freedom, or expecting you to become strong. That does not mean it was always healthy. It means it was formative. And now, many people from Generation X are raising children in a world completely different from the one they knew. They grew up with freedom, sometimes too much freedom. Their children grew up with supervision, sometimes too much supervision. They grew up with boredom. Their children grew up with infinite stimulation. They grew up making mistakes in private. Their children grew up in a world where mistakes can be recorded, posted, shared, and judged by strangers. So Generation X often lives with a complicated tension. They want to give their children the attention they did not always receive. But they also worry that too much protection may create fragility. They understand resilience because they had to develop it. But they also know that some of that resilience came from emotional neglect, pressure, and loneliness. So they're caught between two instincts. Protect the child, but also prepare the child. Be emotionally available, but do not make them helpless. Give them support, but teach them independence. This is not easy, because Generation X is not just raising children. They are translating between worlds. They are the bridge generation. They remember the analog world, but live in the digital one. They remember life before constant connection, but now work and communicate inside systems that never stop. They remember when privacy was normal, but now exist in a culture built around visibility. They remember when authority was questioned quietly, but now watch entire institutions get challenged publicly in real time. They remember when information was scarce, and now live in an age where information is overwhelming. That is why Generation X is so important to understand. They are not simply the forgotten generation. They are the generation that learned to function in the gap between old and new, between silence and noise, between independence and isolation, between loyalty and skepticism, between emotional restraint and hidden sensitivity. And perhaps this is the most powerful truth about them. Generation X was shaped as much by what was missing as by what was present. Less supervision created independence. Less validation created emotional armor. Less stability created preparation. Less trust in institutions created skepticism. Less attention created self-sufficiency. But less care also created wounds. Behind the calm exterior, many Gen Zers carry a deep fatigue. They have spent decades being the ones who handle things. The ones who adapt. The ones who do not complain. The ones who keep working. The ones who hold the bridge together while everyone else argues about where the world is going. And bridges rarely get attention. People cross them, depend on them, use them, but they do not always stop to notice the weight they carry. That may be the perfect metaphor for Generation X. They're not always asking to be seen, but they deserve to be understood, because their psychology tells us something important about human behavior. People are not shaped only by big historical events. They are shaped by repeated, everyday experiences. The empty house after school, the key in the pocket, the snack made alone, the parent coming home tired, the rule that was enforced without discussion, the praise that rarely came, the problem that had to be solved without help, the silence that became normal. All of those small moments taught one powerful lesson. You need to handle it. And Generation X did handle it. They handled childhood independence. They handled economic instability. They handled technological transformation. They handled changing families. They handled workplaces that demanded loyalty but offered little security. They handled raising children in a world they could barely recognize. And through it all, they kept going. But maybe the next stage for Generation X is not just about continuing to handle everything. Maybe it is about learning that strength does not always mean silence. That privacy is valuable, but isolation can be painful. That asking for help does not erase independence. That being seen does not always mean being unsafe. That competence is powerful, but connection is also necessary. Because even the strongest people need somewhere to rest. And even the most independent generation deserves to be supported. Generation X may never demand recognition loudly. But maybe that is exactly why we should pay attention. Because not all strength announces itself. Not all pain becomes public. Not all influence happens in the spotlight. Some people simply hold things together while the world changes around them. And maybe that is the most Generation X thing of all. They did not need everyone to notice. They just kept going, and they still do. If this video helped you understand Generation X in a deeper way, or if it reminded you of someone in your family, your workplace, or maybe even yourself, leave a like. And if you enjoy exploring psychology, human behavior, generations, and the hidden patterns that shape the way people think and act, subscribe to the channel. Because once you understand what shaped a generation, you start to understand the people around you in a completely different way. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.